guys! In today's video, I'm going to be sharing to you guys about the control of the scatter radiation. In today's content, we'll be looking into 5 content actually. The first one is we're going to be looking into the definition or what is a scatter radiation. The second one, and how does the scatter radiation produce, the effect of the scatter radiation, and the factors that affect the amount of the scatter radiation produced. We're going to be discussing the increasing of the scatter radiation, and lastly the method we use as a radiographers to decrease the scatter radiation. What is a scatter radiation? So a scatter radiation is basically the radiation that spread out from the radiation beam and then it interact with substances, for example human body. So when they interact with any substances, it will create a scatter of radiation, or we can say that this is a secondary radiation type that occurs when the beam intercepts with an object, causing the X-ray to be scattered away. And we know the energy of the scattered radiation is usually lesser than the original beam radiation. So for example, during a mammography, a very small of radiation may scatter that to the areas away from the breast, for example the head and neck, our sternum and our thyroid gland. Firstly, we're going to be looking into how does the scatter radiation produce. So they are produced within 3 interactions. The first one is we call as a coherent scattering. The second is the Compton effect, and lastly we have the photoelectric effect. So the first one is the coherent scattering. The coherent scattering is also known as the Thomson scatter, but this type of scattering is occur when relatively low energy levels. So they have 3 phases in the coherent scattering. The first one is when the X-ray photon enters the atom. So the photon energy momentarily transfer into the atom, causing the atom to be in its excited state. So the energy given up by the atom as a photon is the same energy but in altered direction. That's what we call as the scattered radiation, which is the coherent scattering. The second interaction we're going to be discussing about the Compton effect. So the Compton effect processes is that when the photon interacts with the outer orbital electron, imparting some of its energy, so the energy to the electron and the electron ejected out from the orbit. So the ejected electron here we can say as a Compton electron leave the atom with an energy that equals to the excess imparted by the photon just now. So then the photon continues on the outer part, scattered away with lesser energy but with a longer wavelength than before collision. So that is how the Compton effect occurs. So this Compton effect is affected by its KVP. So the higher the KVP we use, the Compton interaction are also increasing. The interaction is we have the photoelectric effect. So this photoelectric effect occurs when the incident photon interacts with the inner orbital, the K orbital or the L orbital, so giving the energy to the electron. So the electron is ejected out from its inner orbital. So the ejected electron will cause a vacancy in the inner orbital. So this vacancy must be filled. So usually the electron from the outer orbital shell will drop to the void. So when the electron fill the vacancy, it may shed an excess energy as a secondary photon. So that's how this photoelectric effect occurs. Moving on into our content, so we're going to be looking into the effect of the scatter radiation. So what will occur? The first one, a fog or noise. So the fog is like this unwanted exposure to the image. So it will cause a darker area of the image and scarcely noticeable. So it will produce a bright or white images that we don't want in our X-ray image instead of the gray because of the fog. So the immediate gray tones will appear more similar to each other, so it's difficult for us to differentiate recorded details with a portion of the image that have the same similar tissue densities. So as you can see in the picture, we have two pictures. So the first one is the A1, the one that uncontrolled scattered radiation that causes decrease in contrast of this radiograph of a phantom abdomen. So on the right side, we have, this is when a bucky is used. So the bucky is used to control the scattered radiation that improve the contrast significantly, so we can see better, and the production of the image, the X-ray image, is better. Moving on the effect of the scattered radiation, we have the contrast reduction. So the degree of the contrast loss depends on the scatter content that radiation emerging from the patient's body. So when the scattered radiation exposed to the X-ray image receptor, it will cause a contrast radiation. So we won't have a maximum percentage of the contrast. So as the proportion of the scattered radiation in the X-ray beam increases, the contrast proportionally decreases. So for example, if the scatter factor is a value of 4, so the contrast to produce is 25%, while in other words, the object area exposure is 75% of the exposure reaching the surrounding background. So when we don't have this scattered radiation, we can produce 100% contrast, while vice versa for when we have the scattered radiation. Moving on into our video content, we're going to be looking into the factor that affect the amount of the scattered radiation. In this case, we're going to look into the increasing of the scattered radiation. So the factors, we have the increase in KVP, increase in the X-ray field size, and lastly the increase in the patient thickness. For the increased KVP, so when we use a higher KVP, so it increases the X-ray transmission and reduces overall absorption. So when we use a high KVP, it will produce a low contrast, and vice versa, when we use a low KVP, we will produce a high contrast. So the amount of the energy that of the scattered radiation exiting the patient depends in the KVP. So when we use a higher KVP, the amount of the scattered radiation will also increases, and it will lower the contrast, so it will cause the contrast reduction. The second factor is that the increase in the X-ray field size. So when the X-ray field size increases, the intensity of the scattered radiation also increase rapidly. So it is important for us to reduce the field size. So this will reduce the dose of the patient and also the staff. So the last factor that we're going to be looking into is the increase in the patient thickness. So imagine thicker parts of the body result in more scattered radiation than the thinner parts. So we can see in the graph below that when the patient thickness increases, the intensity of the scattered radiation also increases. So this patient thickness is something that we radiographers can't control. So we use a compression devices. So these compression devices will reduce the patient thickness and bring the object closer to the IR. So this compression thickness also reduces the patient dose and the contrast resolution. So it will reduce the noise and the fog. Lastly, in our video content, we're going to be looking into the method in reducing the scattered radiation. So we have two methods we can use. The first one, we can use the beam restrictor devices, and lastly, the second one, we have the grid. So there are three types of these beam restricting devices. So the first one, we have the aperture diaphragm. So this one is just the simplest out of all beam restriction devices. It has a lead or a lead line metal diaphragm that attached to the head of the X-ray tube. So the opening of the diaphragm is usually designed to cover the just less than the IR use. The second type is we have the cylinder and the cone beam restricting devices. This is just a modification from the first one, and the alignment is one of the difficulties when we use this type of device. Last but not least, we have the variable aperture collimator. So this beam restricting devices is the best type out of all beam restricting devices that for the radiographer to use. So this is accomplished with the use of the collimator, is referred as a collimination. So the collimator is adjustable in terms of its ability to produce projected fields of the varying sizes. So the field shape produced by this collimator is usually rectangle or square, but it depends if we place the cone, cylinder, or the aperture diaphragm. So it produces the respecting shape of the X-ray images. The second method is we use the grid. We have the grid ratio and the grid frequency. So when we use a higher grid ratio, it will effectively clean up the scattered radiation. As for the grid frequency, so when the higher the frequency, the more strip and the less interspace material and the higher grid ratio. So some grid reduces the thickness of the strip, and this is for to reduce the exposure to the patient. So we need to remember that the higher the grid ratio or the grid frequency will also increase the Bucky factor. This Bucky factor is increasing with the increased KVP. In the last part of this video, we're going to be looking into the grid types. So there are actually 4 types of grid. The first one is the parallel grid. This is the simplest type of grid that we use. But this parallel grid only cleans up in one direction, which is along the axis of the grid. The parallel grid is easier to make, but it can cause a grid cutoff with short SIDs. The second type of grid is we have the cross grid. So the cross grid is actually the modification from the first one. So it made by placing 2 parallel grid on top of each other. But however, the CR must align with the center of the grid, and the grid and the CR must be parallel to each other, or it will also cause the grid cutoff. Moving on to our last 2 grid types. So the third one, we have the focus grid. The focus grid is designed to minimize the grid cutoff. So as you can see in the video, the LED strip are aligned with the divergence of the X-ray beam. So each focus grid must be identified with the appropriate SID. Wrong SID equals to grid cutoff. So the last grid type we have is the moving grid. This moving grid motion starts with a second trigger. So the grid move approximate 1 to 3 inches, so it must be fast enough to not see the grid line for short exposure. So the motion of this grid blurs out the LED strip shadows. So that we have the 4 types of grid. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you for listening to the end of the video. So I can summarize from what we have learned today, that we know what is the scattered radiation and how does it produce by those 3 interactions. We also know the effect of the scattered radiation and the factors that affecting the amount of the scattered radiation, whether it's increasing or decreasing the scattered radiation. So lastly, we have looked into the method to reduce the scattered radiation, because we as radiographers, we don't want much exposure to radiation. We want to minimize the radiation as low as possible. So feel free to correct me in comment if I'm wrong in any other way, and if you have any question regarding this topic, you can comment down below and I'll answer it for you. That's all. Thank you and stay safe. Don't forget to wear masks and always sanitize your hands.